Coming up next is a panel discussion on the development of regional fiber, challenges and opportunities in Africa.
Good afternoon, everyone. it's, uh, it's always one of the toughest sessions to do this after lunch. You know, you're competing with various things. I'm not too sure which is a better session to do, the one just before lunch or the one just after lunch. But nonetheless, I think both are a challenge. I'm hoping that as more people hear my voice in the passages, they'll actually come through and know that we're starting, so that should happen. This afternoon session is quite an interesting session. It's talking about the regional deployment of fiber across the African continent, looking at the different opportunities and challenges that we actually have. So what we're going to do is, I think we're going to introduce the panel. We'll go through just now with a round of introductions. We're going to have a short presentation. We're actually fortunate that we not just have a panelist that comprises of people from within the continent. There's actually Khulud, or as she reminded me in South Africa, we should say Khulud. Actually is based in the Emirates, but covers Middle East and North Africa. And we think it's a good idea to actually do a comparison, not just from within the continent, from slightly outside of the continent as well, and see how some of the issues and opportunities compare. So we're going to do that. So let me introduce myself first. My name is Rufus Andrew. I'm based in South Africa. I work for a company called Corning. And I have to say this. So we're the reason that everybody else is here today, because Corning is the company that invented the first fiber optic for communications in 1970. There were 3 scientists from our organization that worked on it to get the losses to the point where it could be used for communications. And as a result of that, we were the first non-entertainment company to win an Emmy Award for the impact that it had on the media and the entertainment industry. And in 2017, we completed the first billionth kilometer of fiber that we deployed around the world. So it's always very exciting and a proud moment for us to see how an entire industry or industries have evolved from there. I basically head up the business development across the continent, covering all the different Corning businesses, optical being the biggest, but also focusing on the other businesses like pharmaceutical and life sciences, display, consumer electronics, the auto industry, and the other things that have got absolutely nothing to do with us today. So that's myself. I'm going to go around the panel, and maybe if we can just do a round of introductions as well. Khulud, starting with you first.
Hello, everybody. I'm Khulud Al-Durgham, the Director General of Fiber Connect Council, Mina region.
Good
Fiona.
afternoon, everyone. My name is Fiona Songa. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Technology Service Providers Association of Kenya. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ives Mwilu. I'm the Group Managing Director of Ingekora Group, based in Central Africa.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Vian Vermaak. I am the CEO of AfriFiber, based in Djibouti.
Thanks, panelists. And I must say, it's quite an honor for me as well to host the session, because we've got quite a diverse but also esteemed group of panelists. So I feel very humbled to actually do that this afternoon with the people surrounding me. You know, if you look at the African continent, and it's always funny when you talk to people that don't quite know much about Africa, from other parts of the world. They sort of liken Africa to be very homogeneous, which is not the case. They talk about it as being almost a single country, which is definitely not the case. And they don't realize that Africa is made up of 54 countries, if you count the islands with it. You got about 1.2 billion people, officially, probably more. And very different in terms of cultures, different in terms of economics, different in terms of stability, different in terms of political control, and of course different in terms of languages as well. So it makes for a very interesting melting pot, and I think because of that, a very interesting discussion as well this afternoon. And if we look at everything up to the point of subsea cables landing in Africa, it's kind of, subsea is somewhat easier to manage because it doesn't have these different dynamics attached to it. But once it hits the landing station, then that's where the diversity comes in of everything else of how things are done. And I think that's what makes it a very interesting scenario. So we're going to start off just with a few slides that Khulud is going to do, talking about looking at the Middle East and Africa. If we look at the Mina region, long ago, I think some people took the privilege of, or the liberty of slicing Africa at the top, and it's become the norm to almost combine North Africa with the Middle East. And that gave rise to the concept of Mina. But it's still very different if you look at the Middle East and North Africa. And Khulud is going to talk to us a little bit about that this afternoon.
Yes.
Over to you.
Thank you so much, Rufus. And thank you, everybody, for attending this session. First, I would like to start with a few slides, just a small comparison between the Middle East and North Africa. In this slide, we have in the Middle East in total 17 countries, 5.2 million subscribers in fiber to the home and fiber to the business, and 11 million fiber to the home and fiber to the business home passed, and this is as of December 2021. Allow me to break the region into two main groups. The first group, it will be basically the matured market, where we can see that 80% of Mina subscribers are, and the second group, which is have the North Africa countries, you can see the massive progress we saw in this group in 2021. And this group, as I said, it has the North Africa countries. Here in this slide, as you can see, that UAE and Saudi Arabia are leading the ranking in MENA region with approximately 70% of the MENA subscribers. So basically 70% of MENA subscribers are in UAE and Saudi Arabia, and the rest in the other 15 countries. In this slide, I want you to have a look at the growth rate in subscribers in the North Africa countries. As you can see, Egypt, it has more than 200% growth. Algeria, it has more than 100% growth. And Morocco, it has almost 100% growth, again, in FTTH and FTTB subscribers. I have to highlight something that Morocco recorded the highest new subscribers in North Africa in 2021. In this slide, and to evaluate on the notes I said before, you can see here that the top 5 countries in terms of growth in the home pass in MENA region are in North Africa. Algeria registered the highest growth in the home pass in MENA region, coming from lower base. Egypt was always among the top 5, and Morocco also. Here you can see the take-up rate in MENA region. The take-up rate in MENA region basically almost 50%. 70% of this take-up rate coming from or led by UAE and Qatar, and the rest are the other countries in MENA region. To keep viewing the status of MENA region, I would like to show you just the 5G commercial launch in MENA region. As you can see that North Africa countries started launching the 5G commercial this year in Morocco in 2022, and going forward with Egypt, Tunis, Algeria in 2023, and Sudan after 2023. However, the mature markets started deploying or launching the 5G commercial since 2018. This slide has had nothing to do with the panorama, but here I would like to show you the average subscription for the consumer packages. As you can see in the first group, UAE, Qatar, Saudi, Oman, and Morocco, the average monthly plan for the 100 megabyte per second is 75 to 100 US dollar. And the reason for these prices are most of these countries are offering the triple play, which support them in the business case of generating revenue. However, as you can see that Egypt, Algeria, and Tunis, the monthly average for their the consumer price is 31 to 52 US dollar. Summary, just to summarize what I want to talk about today, is MENA region, it sees a big gap, a big digital gap between the Middle East and North Africa. Basically, this gap, it comes from and driven from the policy, the resources, and the stability. The stability is very important in the MENA region because most of the countries are unstable, unfortunately, in our region. A strong challenge for the fiber to the home in North Africa, basically driven by the attractive mobile data and the speed packages in North Africa. In the Middle East side, we saw a strong government support to so many projects and to the national broadbands. However, we don't saw that much support from the government in North Africa. If we compare Middle East and North Africa, we can see that almost 2% average revenue per user on the FTTH, exception Morocco, is driven by the triple play offers. However, the low average revenue per user will require a public and a private partnership and joint funding to activate and to expedite the FTTH rollout in North Africa, as we see in Europe and the US. So basically, this is the slide, just a quick slide just to give you a full picture regarding what's going on in the Middle East and North Africa. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Khulud. Just before we go on to some of the other discussions, are there any questions maybe from the floor specific to what Khulud has shared with us? None? Okay, so we'll go ahead. You mentioned, the triple play and the bundled services, and obviously there's a big difference with the disposable income and the general economies, right, between North Africa and the Middle East. What about access to funding, though? And maybe we can speak about that. Is that a challenge? Do you see a discrepancy between North Africa and Middle East as well in terms of funding?
Yes, actually, we see this clearly because I will give you a small example. In the mature markets, let's say in Saudi Arabia, the Saudi government did the national broadband, plan, which gives a direct or provide direct subsidies to the operators, the telecom operators, to build their infrastructure. In Oman and Qatar, we saw that the government supported in the creation of a national broadband operators. Their mission actually is to mandate and to build the infrastructure and to lease it to the service providers. We never heard about this in North Africa. So absolutely the government plays a very important role in building the infrastructure and supporting the fiber rollout.
Yeah. Is most of the funding still government-based, public sector-based, or?
No, actually, not all the funding comes from the government. So in so many countries, the operators themselves, they do the funding for the infrastructure. But those are like a small examples about government initiatives in the mature market.
Right. Just for those, there's a fair amount of you that may have missed the introduction as well. So Khulud is sort of covering the North Africa and also the Middle East part of our panel and discussion this afternoon. Fiona Songa is covering East Africa, based in Kenya. Ives is basically covering Central Africa, based in the DRC. You're sort of on the border of a few regions, though, Ives. And then Vian is totally confused. He's in Djibouti and not sure which region. You know, is he part of North Africa or is he part of East Africa? So I'm going to ask the same question, though, to the rest of the panel. How much of a constraint do you see funding and access to capital to roll out these networks. And, the state of the play at the moment is there's sufficient funding coming from public sector, from private sector. And have you seen any trends that's actually changing in your specific region? Fiona, can we start with you?
Yes, okay. When it comes to funding, one of the issues that arises is, yes, there is funding coming in through government organizations. The World Bank, the IMF are coming in and helping in putting in seed funding for building infrastructure. However, the companies then are left with the cost of having to maintain and manage, and that affects then the ability for end users to benefit appropriately from the infrastructure that has been deployed and to be able to transform their societies and economies into a digital environment. And part of this has to do with the absence of other challenges, absence of a legal framework to support and things like that, that comes in and affects the ability for the service providers to then continue to maintain and the networks and still be able to turn out profits, because the purpose of being in business is to make money. And you can't be in business when you have no protection for your infrastructure. So every time it's damaged, yes, you got the seed, yes, it was done, the initial amount was done, but then there is no collaboration amongst various regulatory agencies to ensure that that deployment and investment is protected. So you find that the damage on infrastructure becomes higher than the cost of the initial capital, which doesn't make sense.
Yeah. What about Central Africa, Ives?
Yeah, we've seen quite a lot of movement, and I would say it's a bit shared between the public and the government sector. We've seen, for example, what is referred as the Central African backbone being deployed from Cameroon to Bangui, crossing to Brazzaville, into DRC, passing into Angola, financed by the World Bank with the initiative of various governments, and that have seen quite a lot of momentum. I was personally on site, and I've seen very good deployment on the backbone. We've also seen equally that Africa has come on board with a landing station in Brazzaville, in Matundi. And we also see Equano with C-Squared also coming on board with the private sector, again changing the framework of how it's supposed to be done properly with government support. So I will say funding is there. I will say funding is available. And as my learned friend Fiona just mentioned now, it's all about the end users who are going to benefit from the services. And us who are in between this spectrum, we kind of see it as an opportunity to tap in and to accompany basically most of these projects. But right now, especially in Central Africa, government play a regulatory role. This is what we want them to play, to regulate the sector, because it's very broadly open. We have a bad tendency, and I was laughing with you guys just now, where we have a tendency of building the house first and asking for the plans later. And we're trying to force the plans to be built in first, or at least agreed on first before we start building. So that's the risk factor of any investment that we've seen coming through in Central Africa.
Yeah. Vian, how about...
In my market, funding is seen, obviously, it's directly related to the opportunity at hand, and like my colleagues also said, you've got the business opportunity, you've got the socio-economic opportunity. If we look at East Africa, where I'm based specifically in Djibouti, Gulf of Aden, let's say between northeast Africa, we recently saw a volume market like open up Ethiopia, which opened up and it created a massive opportunity, and specifically from a business point of view, but also to a certain extent socioeconomically. In Djibouti, for instance, the scale is so much less. I mean, it's 1 million people, but it's the second most connected country on the continent from an undersea cable point of view, just second to Egypt. So the business opportunity is there, and that's, the role that we play as AfriFiber as the first licensed private company in Djibouti. but also socioeconomically. And what I'm seeing there in the last year and a half is there's a lot of interest from the international community supporting that specific initiative, because it becomes a gateway to the rest of Africa at that specific or critical point. And when you promote and you invest into socioeconomics, the knock-on effect boils down to the business, and it spurs other initiatives and enables entrepreneurship, which creates business. So yes, definitely, there are a lot of different things going on there, and you can see a big interest in that, both from the public and from the private sector.
Right. Yeah, it's always a toss-up, because you find, like, I think we've seen, if you look at the US market, recently that the government announced X amount of money committed to players like AT&T for them to actually roll out networks in the rural areas, basically, to actually fill that gap. So in cases where your ARPUs are too low, or there just isn't a business case, they'd actually roll out services there, just from a point of view of fulfilling an obligation, providing a utility like you'd supply with anything else, like water, electricity, and stuff like that. I didn't see too much of that actually happening, though, in the African region. I don't know if you've actually seen that, because most of the initiatives are private sector driven. The risk with that, obviously, is that there will still be a very marginalized portion of our communities, because there just isn't a business case to cover that portion, right? And I guess that's when governments should actually step in. Have you seen that happen in the region at all, or has that been mostly, we'll regulate, but somebody else pays for it and roll it out? Is that a fair assumption to make? That's the state of the play when it comes to funding?
Yes, we've seen that in the form of a PPP being signed quite a lot in the region. So you'll have, for example, the national carrier signing a deal with a private entity to either bring in finance or deploy on their behalf, and accompany them under one license. So the private party does not get involved in licensing into a very strong and good partnership. But what we've also seen is that the governments are getting a bit more smarter, because, as you know, working in Africa is more tougher. When government changes, basically the person that you had a relationship with goes, and you have to start at zero. So we've seen a very integrated approach to our partnerships supposed to be done, and that has played quite a lot of emphasis in getting our networks, our infra sorted and better quality. And we've seen that quite a lot in Central Africa. For example, the government in DRC, for example, signed a partnership with Egypt, with Benia from Egypt, which is in the region where she is. So for 48,000 kilometers to be deployed. Again, strong relationship guarantees from the government for a private company to come in that's not even within the region. And that's how it evolves, and we've seen that quite a lot in the region.
Yeah. In some of the other regions, is that also a fair assumption to make, that most of it is, government sees their role as pure regulation and policy, but let somebody else fund the networks? Is that the case in North Africa as well, Khulud?
Well, in North Africa, actually, basically, most of the funds comes from the private telecom operators. We didn't see that much support from the government, except the case that you were talking about, Benia, in Egypt. But other than this, let's say, talking about Algeria, which reported the highest growth last year, no, it's basically from the private funding. It's not from the public funding.
Okay, interesting. So talking about, the regulatory side, what's our experience, across the regions as well, and maybe we can all comment for our respective regions. Do we see regulation sort of keeping up with the necessary frameworks for deployment of fiber networks? Do we see it as an enabler or more as an inhibitor at this stage? And also, to what degree is regulation control-based? in terms of governments being concerned that we don't lose control. It's enough that we're not funding it. Somebody else is funding it, and the old saying of EU pays, the piper calls the tune. So, there's some cases where the different governments will regulate purely from the fact that they still want to call the tune. So do we see that, the whole area of regulation, do we see that as an enabler or an inhibitor? What's the experience in your regions? Vian, maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, I've gone, working in South Africa for a number of years, gone from a market where it's very well, or fairly tightly regulated, gone to a market now where there's no regulator. It's being set up at the moment and it's regulated by the ministry. The international community, once again, is very much interested in that area, in the region, and they want to invest to actually build that up. And I think at the end of the day, it's about finding that sweet spot in the middle, and it's about getting a balanced approach to create some kind of a norm and a standard that you can roll out a good quality service across the region. And that's where not only through partnerships, but also through agreements between public and between private needs to come into play, share of infrastructure, and actually collaborating on a socio-economic environment, and then obviously build your business from there.
Others in
Yeah,
Central Africa?
well, in terms of challenges, we can sit here till late tomorrow morning. Africa has its own challenge. But what we've noticed, the most single one has been regulation, but also creation of professional bodies. So being part of Digital Council Africa does raise the industry voice to the regulators to approach the industry slightly differently. And we've been quite honored enough to have launched that in Central Africa, especially in DRC, one of the biggest sub-Saharan country, if not the only one according to Fiona. So the thing is, the industry approach to the regulator is marriage. So once that link has not been done, you're always going to have one party wanting to impose a regulation, and the one wants to do contrary to that. So as an industry professional body, we kind of found a middle term, and we've launched and we've already got involved with the regulator in terms of fast deployment methods, where leaves, what South Africa has done recently, policies, and we're hoping that will improve that enabling. So to answer you, I will say that the government is an enabler, but only if it has enough support from the private sector or the professional bodies.
Fiona, you spend a lot of your time in the space, right? From a regulation point of view, but also from a standards body point of view, in terms of setting the standards and working with different organizations. Is it successful in East Africa?
Well, I think one of the things that needs to happen, and this is across the different East African countries, is there is not yet been a recognition of ICT as an enabler for economic growth.
Still not.
When that happens, then we begin to see ICT as a utility, like the other utilities, water and electricity and sewers and everything else that we roll into our homes. And so in the absence of that, there is a disconnect between the ICT regulator and the regulators of the built environment. And that's the thing we are trying to resolve today in Kenya, to be able to work with the regulator of the built environment to collaborate with the ICT regulator and other regulators so that ICT investments in fiber infrastructure is protected. In the absence of that, we find ourselves in the situation I'd mentioned earlier where the service providers roll out the infrastructure and everybody else comes, and as they're doing their thing, they're destroying the ICT infrastructure. And so infrastructure that is not protected becomes very costly for the service providers and for the ecosystem to manage and to maintain, and stops being a valuable asset that it should be to the users, the end users of these systems. And so the big ask, if I was to be told what would be my ask at this point in time, it would be to ask the regulators of ICT and anything else that is built roads, housing, railway, water, sewer, to collaborate so that as they roll out the infrastructure, there is collaboration with the other, with the ICT service providers so that we have the investments we are putting in. You know, we said the conversion on funding, but that funding has to be protected. So we have that funding protected through systems and mechanisms that ensure it doesn't get cut, it doesn't get disrupted, and the services that are riding on these platforms are also protected. Because I always have this analogy. You are the patient, you are in theater, and your doctor is, say, in India, and they are doing telemedicine. So they are giving instructions to the surgeons here on the surgery you are undergoing, then the fiber gets cut. So what happens to you? They'll close you up. So if you survive, well and good. If where the surgery has reached, you can't survive, c'est la vie. So that is what we are trying to avoid. If we say we're going to have digital economies, we are saying the governments need to be smart. The society needs to be smart. As we go digital, then what are the things we need to do? We need to be able to protect the infrastructure and the investment. So it's still a challenge. Regulation still remains a challenge until there can be collaboration.
Yeah, and it doesn't look like it'll be solved anytime soon. You know, it's probably an ongoing process that you just have to keep on it. I guess it's a very challenging environment. Takes a lot of tenacity, and you gotta really enjoy that to keep doing it. Basically, is that pretty much the same in North Africa as well?
Well, I have to say something that in the MENA region, total MENA region, what we call it the Arab League, which has all the Arab countries. Basically, there is a standardization body, which is the ITU, and the ITU has a strong relation with the national and the regional regulatory bodies in the region, and they have all of these under the umbrella of the Arab League. But if you ask me, actually, what is the achievements that happened since a couple of years, I would say none.
True.
To be honest. Everything is there, but we need sometimes just one step ahead to make the difference. You know what I mean? So we are lacking of that one step ahead in MENA region, but the standards are there, the regulatory body is there, but we just need more push. And I do totally agree with Fiona that we need the digital infrastructure in the MENA region and the speed of the internet is not a luxury anymore.
Yeah.
It should be a utility. It should be something very important.
Yeah, and sorry. Björn?
Yeah, I want to link on to what Fiona also said. You know, I'll give you a typical example. I think it's a lot to do with education. You've got these three utilities. You've got electricity, water, and ICT. And there needs to be an awareness and an education program that this is an essential service. And if you damage this equipment or this essential service, there are repercussions. I'll give you an example. In Djibouti, if you heat a water pipe while you are trenching, even if it's a 50 mil or 100 mil water pipe, 3 minutes the police is there because the community knows this is an essential service and it's water and it's damaged and everybody's there. If the same happens with the telco, that's not recognized yet. That's an education program. We see what's happening in South Africa at the moment with damage and theft and vandalism, but there needs to be a clear education program to bundle those together as essential service, and I think that's the way to go, you know, throughout the region.
Yeah. What about the content side? Is there much regulation on the content side, especially in North Africa? And I'll tell you where I'm getting. I'm going to take you into hot water slightly, Kulu, because I would have thought that after some, I wouldn't refer to it specifically, but after some political incidents that happened roughly about 10 to 12 years ago in your region, that government will be a lot more focused on regulation. You know, maybe on the content side, but certainly on the infrastructure side, because somebody has to switch it off when it needs to, right? Has that had an impact at all? And I'm talking about the Arab Spring, for those who didn't guess that. Has it not had an impact at all, or is there still levels of control as a result of it?
Well, regarding the data and the publicity of the data, I can't say, or I can't talk about it in general. It comes
Yeah.
actually on country basis. I will give you an example. Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar, they have a wide range of data issued publicly, and you can reach it easily. They are giving a rating per service provider, if you want up to this data that you can have, but other countries may not, you know. After the Arab Springs, yeah, I do totally agree. So many things changed, but as I told you, we are one step ahead to reach what we have to. And regarding the regulations, no, I don't think that there was a huge steps coming in the ICT sector. No, we are still lacking behind,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Yeah. So kind of in line with that as well, you know, if you look at especially with deployment of fiber networks, you know, if you look at telecoms, the transition over the last probably 30, 40 years, you started off with an incumbent that was government owned. It was a State Department for all intents and purposes, right? Referred to as Post and Telecommunications, or sometimes they changed the name, but it was still government controlled, government owned. I think the mobile industry changed that a little bit, and certainly with fiber providers, fiber as being fixed network providers, but kind of in a different space. How do you see that happening across the region? I know, Vian, your neighbors recently privatized, and they sort of kept to the word, what they're going to do. Do you see still a role of an incumbent, or is a telecoms provider going to still be pretty much the incumbent, or is it going to be totally privatized? And I think that will make the difference. If it's going to be a utility, because it talks to a lot of things, it's kind of like a dichotomy. At one stage, we're saying private sector should take over and run it because they do the best job. You know, and on the other hand, we're saying it's a utility. And the problem you have then, if you have to provide utilities don't make a profit very often, you know. And then who takes ownership of that and the responsibility? Because there's also a social obligation, right? Not just making a profit. So how do you see that managed in your regions? And Djibouti is probably a good place to start because you're on the one extreme at the moment, right? Everything is just a monopoly, am I right?
Yeah. So you were talking about this transition, postal services. So think South Africa, 1998. That's where I'm now.
Yeah, I think we all started out.
Precisely, same story. Seen this movie, been part of the journey. The nice thing about it is we've made a lot of mistakes, and if you were part of that journey, you won't make the mistakes 2 times, and things can go so much easier. But definitely, look, I mean, there's infrastructure already, established infrastructure, you know, and you have to capitalize on that and actually make use of that. And I think especially depending on the market size, you know, the market that I'm directly involved in is extremely small, but very relevant. In that sharing of infrastructure is absolutely key, and that's where you have to knock on the door to do that type of thing. You know, in larger markets, there's much more scope for something different. But also the opportunity exists also in working with, let's call it the incumbent, or let's say government entities in that regard. If you get your relationship right and you get your agreements right, you can make a rapid change and influence the socio-economic environment and also the economy of not just a country, of a region. So we see what's happening in Ethiopia, like you said now, massive change in the market also, but it's a very large market. So I think there's still definitely a space, but I think it has to have a good blend between private innovation, established infrastructure, and having a good co-opetition in the region. I like that word, and I use it quite often.
Any other comments on that from the panelists?
from the Central African perspective, we've seen, or let's say we are seeing the changes, or let's say COVID had taught us to think differently, more than the telcos. COVID has really taught us to think about costs in your infra. And you know, Africa is still a very virgin, very dense base place. You have so much people in one area, and the rest of the continent is empty. So your cost-based approach to your fiber deployment becomes very interesting. So what we've seen, for example, is the creation of what we call as a model Angolan cable, which is a very, very good consolidated asset-based fiber network approach.
Yeah.
We have seen it in Central Africa, in DRC, we've seen it in Brazzaville, we've seen it in Cameroon, where more and more people are getting in touch with open access network, because the reality, it becomes too costly to deploy to the end user. So that consolidation on open access, where the operators literally become super dealers, if you want, because this is what you want. You don't want to deploy fiber network and it's just the infra. You know, you want to deploy fiber network to get to the end user. And you know, some of my friends, when we walk around those towns, we see less commercial cars and more ladders on the cars trying to put the network. So the approach would be to consolidate your asset, or the approach is now to consolidate the asset, the existing asset, into an open access network. Call it Congo cable, Angolan cable, where the operators now are sharing the client base, and they become super dealers. And you knock on everybody's door, you the Vodacom, the Airtel, the MTN of these days, and you sell more because you don't have to spend so much money in infra. There's already a service provider that do take care of that. So that's the consolidation of assets that we've seen playing out now. But with that, you must keep in mind, and this is a very critical point, you don't want your national carrier to die because of that. Because remember, they hold the licenses, they hold the right of ways. And that has been the discussion that we've seen taking place in the region.
But are the open access networks still privately owned, or?
Some of them are, most of them are in Central Africa. But there's JVs that took place with the national carriers to accompany them. Because the other aspect to finance is government in those regions will tell you we don't have funding. So if you sign a JV, you solve the infra issue and the funding issue, and you have equal share in the venture, or at least some shares in the venture. So you won't lose 100%, but you'll gain at least 40 or whichever commercial agreement you have. And that we've seen quite a lot. It's a big awakening.
Right. Just before we go to the floor for questions, any comments, Fiona and Khulud, on that point?
I think for East Africa, what has happened is the traditional incumbents are still getting support from the governments to continue to be operational. And, you know, the oxymoron of that whole arrangement is that the same governments are still not recognizing ICT as a utility and these entities as utility providers. So it goes against the whole principle of what you talked about, them being utilities and therefore being able to continue, they should continue to provide the social obligations that they are meant to.
Yeah.
And that then leaves the incumbents having to compete with the private sector entities in a space where they get some level of support from government, but not sufficient enough for them to have an impact, an appropriate impact within the ecosystem. Why? Because the private sector are much more aggressive and much more innovative in the way they deliver the solutions. So maybe we may need to see something like what is happening in DRC, where there is open networks. Maybe they need to be allowed to have open networks, different models that allow them to then run with their services, with their infrastructure, and to manage the content and everyone else who's coming in on a sort of open access model. Yep. We need to see that. We haven't seen much of that in the East African region because I think the governments are still too involved in the telcos.
Yeah.
I just would want to add just one comment because, as you said from the beginning, I keep always comparing the Middle East and North Africa. And I have to say that looking at the mature market in the Middle East, like UAE, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, they all achieved fiber to the home high penetration, not only because of the economic situation. At the end of the day, and as a matter of fact, the UAE, when they started deploying their fiber optical network, they started in 2008, in the middle of the financial crisis. Saudi Arabia, when they start building their network, the oil prices were not as the same level as today. So we can't always just blame the economic conditions. I feel, and what I believe in, that the main driver to have the main driver to achieve a very good infrastructure is a vision, a vision that the fiber infrastructure in general and the FTTH in particular are enabled for a knowledge economy base, or a knowledge-based economy that can be achieved by digital transformation. Once we have this vision here, and once it becomes clear, a policy to guide this and resources to implement this, it will be there. So we in some countries, we have a lack of vision towards what they want to do. There should be a long-term plan in investment in the digital infrastructure in the countries.
Yeah. And I guess that's one of the roles that the different councils can play in helping to drive that vision as well. Yeah.
I want to latch on to that also. We spoke in one of the forums yesterday about where does most of Africa's traffic go, and it goes to the US and the content that comes from the US and also from Europe. But we always talk about the African continent, and we talk about the subsea cables that are coming in on the ocean and connecting us to Europe. But what's very important is that we must realize that what's happening inside the continent also, it's just as important, because we say we want to expand and bring these cables and bring the capacity towards Africa. But the reality is the data is leaving the continent because the content is not here. It's in a different place. So when the data leaves, the money leaves. We need to host content and services on the continent of Africa. Now, the key thing, what I think, is obviously optimizing and making it efficient, all these subsea cables. But then there needs to be a very clear drive towards synergies across the border. That's just as important, because you can do the things in country, but the terrestrial interconnectivity, a lot of the countries, as I would know, is landlocked.
Yeah.
And you need to have that equitable access to infrastructure cross borders. And that's what is going to drive, I think, interconnectivity and digital inclusion across the continent. And it's going to drive, opportunities, and then able Africa to stay on the African continent.
Yeah, well, maybe, the next step after making the free trade zone work, that agreement, the next is to make a free access to infrastructure agreement, kind of a thing.
It is actually part of that conversation for those who've been involved. Like I have on the communication services, the infrastructure across the different African countries is part of the discussion that governments are considering.
So it's part of the Act for context.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, that's actually very interesting. I wasn't aware of that. Yep. Okay, so let's pause for a minute to take questions from the floor. Like we said at the beginning, it's always tough when it's a session just after lunch.
The presenters are very good at it.
Yeah, and the lighting is not the greatest, so we can't see if your eyes are open or closed. Any questions? None? Are you spotting anyone?
No.
No
It's
questions. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the skills in Africa. How much of a deterrent is the lack of skilled labor? I think we're not short of labor in Africa. But when it comes to skilled labor, do we see that as a challenge in terms of, the ability to deploy networks fast enough, but also to get labor, turn labor into skilled labor within the context fast enough as well? Is that an inhibitor? I know some markets it's not, but how do you see it in your regions? Khulud?
Basically, there is not such an issue reported in MENA region that we have a lack of skilled laborers in the MENA region compared to other regions like the US.
Right. Okay, that's good to know. Fiona?
I think when it comes to skills, we are good in certain levels of skills, and then there's a level of skills that the region is missing on. And we've seen in the East African region a concerted effort by both private sector and government, for example, in Kenya, to pay attention to particular skills development within ICT. So we've had for the last 5 years a presidential digital talent program that takes the ICT graduates and places them within institution, a certain cadre level of like management trainees, but they're supposed to then use their ICT knowledge, skills, and apply that, while at the same time they're being equipped with specialized skills for networking, management, for being a systems engineer and things like that, based on whatever role that they've been given. And so that then helps us develop that level of skills. Then there's a lot of coding skills within the Kenya ecosystem because we've got a lot of ICT hubs in different parts of the country. So the hubs have become points at which then the young people are able to gather, build applications, try them out. And the ecosystem has been very accommodative because they're able to get data to try out the application, or maybe the Kenyans love to try out many things. So anytime there's a new app, they're uploading and they're trying it out and therefore giving feedback and data to the app developers. But we've also seen areas where we've had to get expertise from outside. So you find like IBM built a skills development center within Kenya, within Catholic University, that is helping develop a certain cadre of skills that they found are a gap within our ecosystem. So yes, skills are a challenge, but again, we are seeing more of private sector involvement, and even the Presidential Digital Talent Program, yes, was run from State House, but the investments and the activities were by private sector. And so it's really private sector driven. If private sector is not going to build those skills, we are the ones who are going to fall short of being able to meet our customers' expectations, because that means that we need to bring skills from off the continent that will cost so much more.
Yeah. But, you know, and I think when it comes to the level of apps up the food chain, there's a lot of funding and a lot of interest, right? That's,
Yes.
I always say that's the sexy part of the industry. But at the level of actually training people to splice, and to splice properly, you know, and to splice quickly, and to use some of the sophisticated equipment, at that level, do you find that the skills development is sufficient and there's sufficient skills? How about in Central Africa? Is that an issue at all?
I'll be very honest with you. It all depends on where you're looking, how you look at it. Any skills that you import costs a lot on the network, bottom line. Okay? So we don't
but
want...
do you have to do a lot of that or not?
Yes, unfortunately in Central Africa. But I must say that when it comes to the fundamentals, because you know technology evolves, okay? When it comes to fundamentals, we do have a baseline. We have one of the few best CTOs, for example, in the country that can manage the network in the state that is into. So you really have to do a lot of re-engineering in that. But in terms of skills, it's evolving. We need a lot more than that than currently what we have as a baseline.
In the specific market where I'm located, you know, there's, let's call it technical ICT type of skills, specialist skills is extremely scarce. The challenge is always, okay, you have to bring in some specialist skills from abroad, but then the thing is you want to do knowledge transfer and skills transfer as soon as possible to be able to have continuity in your business, because I mean that's what you want to develop is local skills. Looking across the borders, yes, the markets are bigger, but it's a bigger pool of people you can see there. But I think in general, you know, it's like we were talking about splicing and speed of splicing, things like that. You know, there's people who do it, and you know, there's people who've done it for their entire life, and then to find those people and then to get them to work with you to develop other skills locally. I think that's something that we focus on quite a bit.
Right. So just in closing, we've spoken, I think we've probably spoke about more challenges than opportunities. But if we have to, look at what do we see as the single biggest opportunity, and I'll go first because I'll steal this one just in case anybody else is going to do that. And to me, it's the increase in OTT services and players. If you come and see, the driving force that's going to be introduced by the likes of your Metas, your Googles, even some of the, I'm not sure if you can call them OTT players, but your sort of hosting players, right? The international ones, your Microsoft, Amazon, and even continental players as well. I think there's definitely a lot of investment from those players going into the market, especially the ones that's focused more on the consumer side, because that's where the growth is on the content side. And to a certain degree as well, it's easier to skill up on that part. And we all have experiences. We saw people in the most rural communities using smartphones and stuff. So I think getting used to the skills in terms of interacting on the content level is not the biggest challenge. And that is why a lot of the big players are going. And that's an opportunity, I think, that's going to drive the deployment of fiber networks. But what do we see as some of the other key drivers and the opportunities that Africa has that's probably not as much seen in some of the more developed markets, or maybe it's just a timing issue, that we actually see over the next few years coming our way?
Well, for me, I can say that they have a very good opportunity to have a very good digital infrastructure, because the digital infrastructure was not established before, like the copper and everything. Yeah. So they have the opportunity to build a fiber digital infrastructure which is more safe, more sustainable, and secure, speed, and this is an opportunity, I guess.
Yeah. So there's not much legacy that you can so you can leapfrog to the later technologies, because there isn't much legacy that's going to hold you back, which you've invested in. I mean, if you look at Europe, for example, there's certain parts of Africa, I think, that's got a higher fiber penetration than some of the parts, because we're not waiting for a payback on the old infrastructure. Any others?
I believe that there are opportunities for digital inclusion. We started off by talking about the digital gap. But within that, there is also an opportunity of digital inclusion as a result of trying to fulfill that gap and close it, reduce it as much as possible. And this will happen through the infrastructure. When the infrastructure is well managed, is protected, and it's able to run a digital economy, that means governments are able to offer government, so we've got e-government services. It means businesses, we can have more e-businesses coming on board, local business as well as international. We've got the OTTs that you have mentioned coming on board. And then we are able to make sure we've got the skill sets that are required to maintain the infrastructure. And that way we end up ensuring that the entire society is included. There is a digital inclusion for everybody. And then we will be able to make use of those opportunities and be able to deploy more infrastructure into the homes. And so that's the one opportunity that I see.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think in Central Africa, to just sum it up quickly, while the digital infra has been looked at in the cost base line, there's digital platform, there's financial services like Fiona said, and there's also digital entrepreneurship with those startups. So those single packages, for those who are in the room, are interested to venture in there beside the infra, there's definitely rooms for opportunities. And it's open.
Yeah.
Less legislated.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to support these, my two colleagues' views on that. Digital inclusivity is, I think, a key driver. Whatever you have to do to promote that, and enable other entrepreneurial and innovative services. We all talk about fintech, that's the
Yes,
latest
fintech.
buzzword across the African continent, people being able to transact over a mobile device, things like that. You know, it's not pie in the sky that a street vendor selling apples can actually have a QR code on his apple. Why should you have a sticker? Why should you be able to take cash? That's all being driven by digital inclusivity. And whatever we have to do to promote that, that's the solution, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, you know, we spoke about a lot of challenges, and I think we haven't exhausted the challenges. I'm pretty sure there's a lot more that we haven't even touched on. But I think more important than that is there's just so much of opportunity. And, you know, my vision and hope for Africa within the space is that the growth in networks, you know, whether it's fiber, mobile, and I think it's all integrated in any case, that is one way of creating equity with the rest of the world. And in some cases, not just equity, I think it actually advances us. Because, you know, if we talk about things like your work from home and doing business remotely and things like that, because as a society, we were sort of used to that in any case. You know, there's still a big portion of the society that's still rural, that, you know, if you look at the percentage of people that woke up and went to offices every day, it's still the minority in Africa, right? But where we are, we can actually be trendsetters with being able to work within a culture of being remote as an individual, remote as a society, and remote as a business. But because of technology, we can still have access and interact with the rest of the world. Yeah. There's many societies that's battling with that, and we actually saw that with COVID. And I think Africa has a chance in that, given the right access and technology, we can embrace that culture a lot better than others, right, if we have the right levels of access to the rest of the world and at least to each other. And to me, that's the biggest opportunity. So it's leapfrogging, not just in terms of technology and infrastructure, but also leapfrogging in terms of a culture set of how you actually interact with each other and how you actually interact with the rest of the world, basically. And I think that's another opportunity as well. Just before we close, are there any final questions or any questions? Let me take it. I think I saw one hand there from the gentleman. You need a mic, right?
Hi, my name is Jafri. I'm from Huawei. You were talking about the opportunities. So when you talk about opportunities, before we come to the opportunity, should we not discuss and focus on the fiber coverage in the African market? Let's say, for example, South Africa, a country with a population of around 60 million people, we haven't even reached 20% of the coverage of fiber in the country as well. So, and don't you think the coverage along with the utilization of data will bring in more opportunities? So should we still, so we must first focus on providing the coverage to the population of the African countries and then focus on the opportunity, because they will come automatically then.
Yeah. Do one of you want to answer that before I jump in? Yeah.
You know, my view on that is that I want to get back to digital inclusion. I think that fiber is just a tool to achieve that, whatever you need to do to actually get that. And I think that should be the primary focus. Yes, fiber is a very robust and baseline sort of technology to do that, and that should move ahead at a rapid pace, because that's going to set the trends for the future. But I think whatever needs to be done right now to promote digital inclusion, including rapid acceleration of fiber, I think that's the key.
Yeah, I will add on to that, and I will give you a practical example, right? I'm sitting in Brazzaville, and I had a few dollars with me, and I didn't have a Visa card, and I slept hungry that day because no one could take my Visa card, and neither no one could take $1 with it, and they wanted francs CFA. But the thing is this: while we ate it, while we deploying the infrastructure, there's an opportunity currently existing in that sector. This is what I'm saying. So let's tap onto that and create those e-services, those the fintech. They're using Pesa, Momo, and all those stuff. But the youngsters, the starting up companies in inverted comma can already piggyback on that, you know, and start with it, because there's a huge opportunity in that sector. So that's what I'm saying. So you're right, the infra is critically important, but right now there's an opportunity already because they do have fiber, they have OPGW, they're running north to south to Bangui, but simple services, it's non-existent.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. You know, I think the reason you roll out fiber is not for the sake of rolling out fiber. There has to be the drivers in place. And I think what we're saying is that doesn't matter how rural you go. Traditionally, there might not have been a business case to get there, but we show that and we've seen that the drivers and the opportunities are there because there's services and applications that could benefit the most rural.
Yes, true.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions quickly? I know we're slightly over time. Nothing else. Well, I'm not going to prolong it. Thank you very much. Thanks to the organizers of the conference for giving me the pleasure to host the panelists this afternoon, and thanks for the panelists for actually being here and sharing your insights this afternoon. Thank you very much. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for listening to us and paying attention, especially after lunch. Thank you very much.
Next up is a Mapping Africa presentation, a policy advisor with the Mozilla Corporation, a consultant on access regulation and policy to the Association for Progressive Communications, and a research partner with the Network Startup Resource Center. His blog, manypossibilities.net, is a popular destination for anyone working on African telecommunications and internet issues. We are joined by Steve Song.
It's a privilege to be here and to have the opportunity to speak today. You know, I would say if you've come across my name before, it's probably associated with one of these maps, and something that began as one map back in 2009 has evolved into over 55 maps over 13 years, and going from one undersea cable to 25 undersea cables serving the African continent, which I think is remarkable, and that's what I want to talk about today. But before I do, I want to say one thing about the evolution of technology, and it's a particular insight, I think, from the last couple of years of the pandemic, and that is that technology is not neutral, right? That technology is an amplifier. It amplifies our abilities, and an unfortunate side effect of that is that those without access to technology fall further behind simply by standing still, as those with access to the internet and to internet infrastructure grow in capabilities. So we have to be careful not to increase the digital divide in our investments in technology and how we think about investment in technology. So winding back the clock to 2009, I mean, it is phenomenal just how much has changed. You know, there was a single undersea cable serving the continent, capacity of less than 2 terabits per second. And if we fast forward to, this coming year with the arrival of Google's Equiano cable and Meta's 2Africa cable, that our projected capacity will be more than 814 terabits per second. I mean, that's a over 400 times increase in capacity of internet infrastructure serving the continent. And of course, you know, emboldened by my success in mapping undersea cables, I began an initiative to map terrestrial fiber cables, and that turned out to be a much more challenging exercise. This is the after fiber map that I've collected from various sources, and I'd say it's probably about 70% accurate. I mean, it does reflect tremendous growth of terrestrial fiber on the continent, but it is just a piece of the picture. And I think, these are tremendously good news stories. Undersea cables, terrestrial cables are tremendous. They tell a completely different narrative about the continent and its socio and economic growth. However, we're entering a new phase now in terms of internet growth. And while the number of people coming online is growing, that rate of growth is slowing overall. And this is a critical thing to unpack, especially in the context of this inequality that grows between those who have access and those who don't. And the reason for this slowing growth is pretty straightforward. We've connected the relatively wealthy and urbanized people on the planet. And the people who remain unconnected mostly live in harder to reach areas and have income levels that are much lower. So it becomes a much bigger challenge to connect them. And it's also a big challenge to say, well, who is connected? I mean, and indeed, what does being connected really mean? And one of my frustrations is that as we begin to poke at the data about who is connected, the numbers are much squidgier than you might imagine. So here's a report from the International Finance Corporation profiling Africa's e-economy in 2020, and it says fairly clearly that there are 39.8% of the population in Africa is connected to the internet. Well, if you unpack that footnote, you see that references a site called Internet World Stats, which is a marketing group. And that draws on various sources from the ITU and others, but indeed those numbers are estimates. They aren't based, we don't have enough concrete information about who is connected. And so there's a need to understand the infrastructure of the internet in much more detailed terms, because I think that is the foundation to having a better understanding of who is connected. And it's important, not just about connecting the unconnected, but it's also important from the point of view of how it shapes our lives. So, if you think back to the emergence of, trade via sailing ships in the, 14th, 15th, 16th century, it's not a coincidence that those sailing ships wound up in the West Indies in North America. The trade winds, the ocean currents, the continental gyres, drove those ships in that direction and, and influenced trade in a way that, was largely invisible, to the viewer, but had a profound effect on where trade developed. And I think that's largely true of the internet, in that the economic development of the internet is largely influenced in the same way by this deep infrastructure. And I think fiber optic cables are indeed the trade winds of the digital age. And undersea cables are easy to track thanks to the work of telegeography, who do an amazing submarine cable map, profiling undersea cables around the world. But when it comes to terrestrial infrastructure, there's a need for more transparency to understand how it is shaping our world. And there is good practice out there. There are great examples of transparency. You've got Dark Fiber Africa in South Africa that publish a detailed map of their network, BCN in Nigeria, but they are more the exception than the rule in terms of detailed maps. And even continental services such as Africa Bandwidth Maps or the ITU's transmission maps don't allow you to download that data to be able to combine it with other kinds of socioeconomic data to really develop deeper insights into how the internet is shaping our lives. Well, happily, I think that's changing thanks to a multi-stakeholder initiative that spearheaded by Mozilla and the World Bank and ITU, Liquid Intelligent Technologies, one of the largest fiber network operators on the continent, C Squared, who operate metro fiber networks in the continent, the Internet Society, and the Digital Council Africa. And together, we're pushing for an open data standard to describe terrestrial fiber networks. Now, we're championing more transparency in general, but the first barrier that we're seeking to overcome is this issue of how do we know, better understand the disposition of fiber networks on the continent. And we think that has tremendous benefits, and multiple benefits in terms of how that transparency will change things. I think hopefully it will lead to more targeted investments, less duplication of investment in infrastructure, better coordination across sectors, between road and electricity, rail, oil and gas. These are all sectors for which there is public data available. And by putting these together, not only will we see more opportunities for perhaps co-investment in infrastructure, but less interruption and the reduction of physical network interruption by one sector over another. I can't help but point to this article from 2 months ago in Ghana, where MTN claims they suffered 939 fiber cuts in 5 months. And a lot of that was due to other sectors, digging up roads, digging up things without knowledge of where fiber infrastructure was. And of course, there are opportunities for ISPs, with more transparency, business opportunities, niche business opportunities to deliver services in areas that are unserved, better information for investors, and opportunities to take a more holistic, a more kind of regional approach to understanding the problem. And just to illustrate that a little bit, this is some crowdsourced fiber information for Nigeria, which I've overlaid over a map of poverty levels in the country. And this is the kind of insight that a Ministry of Telecommunications, or indeed the Ministry of Finance, can look at and identify areas where there's a critical need to rebalance investment to serve those who perhaps can least afford it. And we can, if we zoom in a little here, we can look a little closer. And here's another set of data. This is looking at Kano in northern Nigeria. And here, while I've got the fiber networks and the points of presence on the networks, I've combined that with data from the GSMA's mobile coverage maps. That's in purple there, that shows where the LTE coverage is, and the Ookla mobile download speed data, which is publicly downloadable. Those are those little green lines you can see there. And we can, using these open data sources of data, we can begin to validate and make more sense of the internet infrastructure that exists. And we can spot opportunities. So there's those little red blobs there. They identify towns of greater than 25,000 people. And for instance, if I saw that there was a town of more than 25,000 people that was less than 10 kilometers from a point of presence, well, that might be a business case right there for the municipality of the town, for an operator to invest in connectivity. So this group of organizations, we made a pledge earlier this year in June at the World Telecommunications Development Conference, and we committed to the collaborative development of an open data standard to describe ICT infrastructure. As I said, we are beginning with fiber, but there are other parts of the sector that could do with a little more transparency as well. So what does that open fiber standard look like? Well, it comprises the network, which breaks down into the network links or the fiber itself, but also the nodes, which are the oases, the critical points on the fiber network where access is provided, but also looking at it from a timeline perspective, the phases of development, so we can see the development of infrastructure over time, and indeed also who the investors are in the network, who the operators are of the network, and with that really sort of gain a more holistic picture of investment in fiber across the continent. And indeed, we're starting in Africa, but the intent is for this standard to be applicable everywhere. Now, I'm happy to say we've published a draft of that standard. It's available on GitHub. For the software developers among you, you may be familiar with that as a repository of software code. Well, it's also very good for data standards and data sources. I encourage you, please, to get involved. The opportunity is for everyone to have a voice in defining this standard. There are discussion forums and the opportunity to raise issues that you feel may need addressing in this standard. And we hope this will be a transparent, open process where we develop a standard that makes everybody happy and everyone is happy to participate in. So with that, I mean, I just want to say thank you again for the opportunity to address you today and to encourage you. Here's the URL for the site, and please do feel free to get in touch with me directly if you have any interest or questions. Thank you very much.
In closing, please welcome the closing speech by the CEO of Digital Council Africa, Junita Clark.
Thank you, Bora. That was really good. Like Bora said, if you remember, you get access to it. I mean, this is a tiny snapshot of the work that he does. So it's really substantial. From this, it actually goes into per country deep dive. So it's something that we're really proud of, work that we do for our members. So yeah, guys, thanks for joining us this year. Back after all this time, we're a little bit rusty, but yeah, this is, I can't believe it's over. And all the hard work, and then we build up, and then 2 days, and then it's finished. So just a couple of things. We had close on 700 registrations for this year event. It's actually way less than what we normally do, but we're very glad with the response and the turnout and how it looks and how it came together. We had 400 people through the doors over the last 2 days, 85 speakers, and I forgot to count the amount of countries. But one thing I wanted to just quickly bring to your attention, it's the first year that the Fiber Council Global Alliance have been together again in probably 5 years. But Geloed, don't you want to stand up? Geloed is my colleague from Dubai. She's based in Dubai. And I just wanted to wish her a very happy birthday today. We forgot. We've had a wonderful week together. We had several meetings, and we took them on a little safari, so they got to see some wonderful animals, and we've spent some time really talking about how we can work together. So for those of you that don't know, the FCGA are 5 industry associations that have formed a global body. We're more than 550 individual members globally that work together to move the needle on the digital economy and to expand broadband to as many people as we can. Thank you everyone for joining us this year. It's been a real privilege to serve you. Please, like Bora said, if you're not a member, become one, support our work. But otherwise, we look forward to seeing you next year. Watch this space. We'll make some announcements soon. Have a wonderful day. Thanks. Travel safe.
To our sponsors and partners, thank you for participating.